Hello, and thanks for joining me today for today's Criterion Learning Series presentation. My name is Steve Tompkins, Principal Solutions Architect with Criterion, and today I'm going to be talking about deductions in Criterion HCM. I do want to mention right up front, we do have a chat and a Q&A that we'll try to monitor and answer questions as they come up. If we're not able to answer them during the call today, what we'll do is we'll follow up with you to make sure any questions get answered. I also want to point out that we are not going to be talking about the taxability and how those things are interpreted as far as what the government might say something should be taxed. Criterion support is not a tax advisor. What we can do is once you have spoken with a tax advisor and they tell you how something should be taxed or not taxed, we can help you to configure the system to meet that requirement. So with that being said, let me jump into my system here. So give me one moment to switch this around. And I'm going to start off in self-service, just so you can see where the employee would see deductions in the system, and then we'll talk about the configuration of it. So here in self-service, of course, you may want to have your employees be able to see their deductions and those things that are going to be coming out of their paychecks. And of course, they can see that on their pay stub. However, there's also an option here under the pay menu to look at your deductions that are, or the employee to look at their deductions that are going to be potentially coming out of their pay stub. So this is an example of what it might look like. You'll see this person has 3 different deductions here, and they can see, what is the effective date, the employer amount. If you have an employer amount, you can see I can rearrange these columns. Here's the employee amount. And you'll notice there are, columns I can turn on or off if I needed to, for example, hide the limit. I could do that right there. And they can see other deductions they may have had previously. If they want to show that information, they can view that information there. And of course, as I mentioned, they would be able to see this information on their pay stub. So when they go into their pay history and I don't have any current one, but I could go into my pay stub here. I see that there were some deductions and that's what came out. All right, so just an example of where the employee can see this information in the system there. Of course, the configuration of it is all going to happen where the administrators are playing, and that is under payroll. So, of course, I could get to the settings in either one of these things here, or any one of these things, but I'm going to go into payroll specifically just so it's usually where people are going to go to their settings here. So that is going to be under your settings icon in the top right. And you'll see the menus over here for this. Now, there are a few things that can go into your deductions. The first thing I want to talk about, and some of this is not under your control, it's one of those few items that you cannot edit even as a system administrator. It's a variety of deduction types that are set by the tax engine, and this is for the US and Canada. So you might see things in here that mention 401k or things that are mentioned Roth and those types of things. So these are various ways the deductions can be handled as far as taxability or how it shows up on tax forms and things like that. So I've sorted it by this code, and the code is not something you have control over for these. You'll see if I click into, let's say, this Canadian RPP, there's really nothing you could do here. There's just, you can look at this and see what what it says up here, but behind the scenes is where all the magic happens. Now, sometimes you may need to set up something new. Perhaps, as I mentioned, you talked with a tax advisor and they say, this deduction, it needs to be pre-tax over here or that type of thing. And maybe there's not a configuration already set up that way. You could add new ones. Now, when you add a new one, you have to start it with a high number. I always start with 1,000. That's not you have to do 1,000. You could do like 1,200 or something like that. But I start with a high number just so it's separate away from all these things that come with the system. And you come up with a name for it. You'll see here's a maximum amount. So there's a certain limit to how much can come out. And then you can go through and you can select the tax codes where you need to apply whatever the situation is, the maximum amount of tax. So you can set these up if you ever need to do that. It's very similar to what we talked about a few weeks ago when we were talking about incomes. Sometimes you need to set up compensation types. But what I would say in here is if you have any questions about this, please don't hesitate to ask. We'd rather help you out and make sure that it's calculated right than have to come back in and fix something if it's not set up correctly. And of course, we'd also recommend trying this out in a sandbox. So if you have a new situation and you don't see something in here or you need to set it up, using your sandbox to test that stuff out, maybe show your tax advisor what's happening and they can say, yes, that's exactly what we need, would be a great way to test that out. And of course, you can always reach out to support, get, how does this all work, but reach out using the help email address and so forth. All right, also under payroll admin up here, you'll notice that we have deduction frequency. This is also a key piece of the setup of a deduction. And this is telling it when the deduction should come out if you have multiple pays in a certain month. So I have a few different ones set up here just so you can see what's going on. So let me click on this weekly one as an example. The code and description can be whatever you like. So, maybe you call this 01 and the description is every other week or something like that. You can call the code anything like, the description anything like. I recommend it be descriptive of what you're doing. Don't just call it like 1, 2, 3, 4 with no explanation for what that means. Might make sense to you, but if somebody else has to come in and figure it out, it might be a bit difficult. Anyways, here's the unit. So this tells it how frequently it would come out. And when I select something like weekly, I can tell it, okay, the periods in the month. Is it the first week, second week, third week, etc.? Maybe it's just the first week and doesn't include the last week. When there's 5 pay periods in a month, maybe you don't do the 5th pay period. So you might do something like this. All right. And you can select these just by clicking into this multi-select dropdown. All right. Here you can tell it, how do we determine the payroll number? Is it by pay date or pay period end date? Because sometimes those are, of course, be different. The pay period might end, let's say, on the 30th of the month, and the pay date is not until the 3rd. So is that the first period or the last period? And so that's how that could be determined right there. Okay. And then we also can say, we'll just ignore the frequency. We don't care if it's weekly, biweekly, or whatever. Let's just ignore that. But still, you can tell which pay period. All right. And of course, you can set up as many of these as you like. I would recommend having different descriptions for each one, just so you are clear when you get into the setup of which one does what. And I don't know if I have any old ones, but if you do have ones that are inactive, you can always toggle this to show them. All right, let's get into some deductions. I'll show you some example ones and you get an idea of how they'll be configured. Now, some of these may be tied over to benefits. So we've talked many times about benefits. If you're adding a new benefit, you actually have to add the deduction first, unless you're copying an existing one, in which case it'll create the deduction for you based off of the old one. But if you're starting from scratch or you never have done that type of benefit before and you want to start new, you have to add the deduction first. Otherwise, when you get to the benefit setup, there's a required field called deduction and you'll have to come here anyways. So might as well do it first. So let me click on this 401k as an example here. The code, just like in that deduction frequency, you can call it anything you like. Sometimes you have like legacy codes from systems that you've had for many, many years. You maybe since the beginning of the company in the 60s or something, and you're using a mainframe and the code might be 01 or something. You can duplicate that if you like, maybe just for consistency purposes. We don't have any requirements as far as the code is concerned. We recommend it be unique. But if you want to use, I don't know why you want to, but if you want to use the same code for everything, I guess that could work. I've never done that myself because I like to be able to know what's what when I'm looking at reports and exports and of course in the system. Same thing with the description here. It doesn't need to match the code. You might want to say this is the 401k. I don't know, let me just see. This is an amount or all right, this is a percent. So I might want to say percent. Okay. And then this is that deduction type. Remember, I was just talking about that down here in the configuration. Is the deduction types you would see over here. So that's what these are. And you can, of course, select whatever's appropriate for this one. Now, a thing to remember is these are, as you can see, I went into an existing code I can change them after I've set it up, even after I've started using this deduction. So let's say you accidentally set this up as, I don't know, 401k CU over 50, and then you realized you made a mistake. You can come in and change that. Now, it may have an impact on how things are taxed or were taxed when it got calculated. So just be aware that if you inadvertently select the wrong thing, you can come in and change it, but you may need to go and make some adjustments to what's already happened out there. So be aware of that. All right. Which pay types does this come out of? Usually it's regular or regular and supplemental pays. Sometimes it's supplemental only, or it's custom. It's not any one of these, it's a custom one out there. But for my 401k, I'm going to just say regular. So only the regular payments will it come out of. All right. If I need a system label, this a lot of times can be used to show in a certain box on the tax forms, like the T4 and the W2. So you might need to do that. Now, some of that is driven by the deduction type, but if you need it in a specific box outside of what's in the deduction type, you can also do that. It also could be used for different formulas. So this might be one of those situations where you have to work with your implementation or support person in certain situations. All right, the priority here. So this could have a big impact when we're talking about garnishments and stuff like that. Does this come out before garnishments, after garnishments, the priority that those garnishments go? So you can be very careful with that. If somebody has multiple garnishments, which is the biggest garnishment, or the one that should go first and second and so forth, that's what the priority is used for. Starting after. So what this means is once the one of these deductions has reached this limit, then this deduction is going to start. So a lot of times that happens with like catch-up deductions. They've reached the annual limit for the 401k, and now the catch-up deduction should start. So that's what that allows you to do, is say once they complete this one, then the other one starts. All right, I'm going to go over to the right, and then I'll go down to the other settings here. So first off, if you want the deduction to be available to select and stuff, it needs to be active. If it's not active, I can't add it to employees. It won't remove it from employees if it's been added and then you come and make it inactive. It's not going to go through and delete it from everybody. It just means it's not active anymore. Auto makeup allows you to track how much should have been deducted if somebody maybe doesn't have enough pay or enough hours to have this deduction. Maybe you want to have that amount kept in arrears. So that's what the auto makeup allows you to do there. Do we want to show this to the employees? Maybe there's a deduction where it's employer only. The employee doesn't really need to know about it because it doesn't impact their payroll in any way, but you're using it for some type of calculation or workers' comp or something like that. And you don't want to show it to the employee because it would just cause more confusion than it's worth. So you could choose to not show that to the employees. Using an off-cycle payment. So as you may be aware, when you're processing payroll, most payrolls are on cycle, which is like your every payroll, your normal payroll situations. But sometimes you have bonuses or other situations where it's outside of the normal payroll cycle. Would you like this deduction to be included in that? So you may want to check that off for a 401k or something. So you can do that right there. Pooling. So this is very typical with things like retirement. So they may have a choice to do a percentage or an amount, or they can do pre-tax and after-tax, or they could do any combination. Maybe they say, I want $10 after-tax and 3% pre-tax, but they all have the same shared limit. So you would pool them together in that situation. All of the deductions that should be pooled would need to have this checked. And then you can set one of those as kind of the parent record for everything else, where it's going to read all of the rules as far as the limits are concerned. All right, by checking pool, this common match will enable that allows you to set the match for all of the pooled deductions if you need to. All right. Do we want to show the employee and employer match, or excuse me, cost? Do you want to just show the employee cost, or do you want to hide it completely? That's what that show cost is for. How is this calculated? So this one, there's a lot of different things that can happen in here. I'm not going to go into all the details of every single one of these, but you'll see percentages of gross or net, a match, meaning there's an employer contribution, of course, amount with a match. If you're doing certified payroll, certified rate, which should be an amount, a percentage. So you can see those right there. A formula. So a formula might be looking at hours or combination of things. So that would be a formula. And of course, we would help you with that configuration there. Garnishment, this enables all the garnishment fields to track stuff like who it's for, what agency, and so forth. And you'll see here even ones where I can look at the hours. So looking at the hours out there if I need to do that. All right, I'll set it back to this. What is the contribution type? So if I'm doing percentage and gross, your contribution type is going to be employee and employer because there's probably some type of calculation for that employer amount. But sometimes it's employee only or sometimes employer only. So you have those options there. And then down here are the frequencies. Remember, I set up the deduction frequencies under payroll. So that is that deduction frequency here. Now, this may not say weekly in those things. It might depend on what you called them. Mine, I happen to name weekly. This would be the default employee contribution. Now, with something like a retirement, a 401k, or other types of retirement, the employee probably has an option for how much, so you wouldn't necessarily set a default there. But maybe it's like a pension and it's always a certain percentage. You can preset it. So when the deduction is added to the employee, it's just going to do that percentage. That's kind of like what's happening here with my employer match. This is saying the employer match is 100% match up to 3% for this employee, and then 50% match for the next 3%. Now, yours might be different. Of course, you can work on that, and you can have more than those if you need to. And again, we're here to help you out with those matches if you need any type of assistance on that. The limit. So if this deduction has a limit, what is it that we're looking at to determine that limit? In this situation with my retirement here, there's an annual limit for how much can be withheld. Sometimes you may have a lifetime limit or it's per pay period. And of course, you can set that right there. So I set this one to year. Is it a combined limit between employee and employer, or are they separate limits? So you'll see here when I do combined, there's the total limits, and then separate, I have two separate fields. All right, now when I do combined, we tell it what do we do with, what happens when they hit the limits? Is it just split 50-50? Do we allow, the employee amount to stop first or the employer amount to stop first? What do we do when they reach that limit? And then here is the limit. You'll notice because I have separate limits and I said it's employee and employer, I have two. Obviously, I haven't updated this in a little while because I have 19,000 as the limit here, and it's much higher now for 401k. But this would be the annual or yearly limit for this. Now, this is the default. Similar to that employee contribution, this is the default amount. If I left this blank, it means I need to set it on the employee. So this might be a great example with like a garnishment. You would say that there's a lifetime limit, but you don't know what it's going to be from one employee to the next. So you leave that blank. All right. And then, of course, there might be an employer limit when I have separate. So in this situation, the employee amount might stop once they reach 19,000, but the employer continues until they reach 24 or vice versa. Or maybe they're the same or whatever you're doing as far as your limit is concerned. And then finally, because I have checked pool up here, at some point I need to determine which one is the parent. The parent one, you would actually leave this field blank, and all of the other ones that are related to it, it would show the parent code in this field. So in my example here, this is the parent. When I go to one of the child ones, let's say 401k Roth, I would select 401k, and then you'll notice how it has those same limits already here. These are not settings I can change because it's reading from 401k. So that's how the pooling works. You leave one of them blank, and then you go to the other ones that are related to it. You think of them as children or child ones, and you select the parent. All right, so that is a configuration in there for different ones. I'll show an amount one here just so you can see one that has an amount, very similar setup, except for the calculation method is amount. All right, this one does not have a limit, which means it's just going to keep going forever and ever until it expires, the employee terminates, they change plans or something. And let me see if I have one. Here's one where there's a formula, just to give you an idea of what a formula could look like. So here's the employer contribution is the WC premium is the workers' comp premium times the gross wage. These are both tokens in there that are going to determine those amounts. And I'll show you here where that is. It talks about this. So in the help, we give some examples for how this might work. And I believe if you come down here, there's going to be ones in here that will talk about different formulas that can be used. Let's just see here. So you may use tokens in this field. If this works for me, it'll take me over there. Let's see if it makes me log in. For some reason on my browser, I have to click here first, and then I can go to the links. I think it's something in my browser I need to configure, but now this will link and give me some examples of tokens. So here you'll see one for disposable pay. So for garnishments, disposable pay. Here you'll see deductions, talking about the sum of deductions between certain priorities, the smallest of the ones. So these are just examples that you might use in there. You'll see gross wages. It tells us what this all means. As I mentioned, if you have questions, if you're not sure exactly how this works and you want to make sure it's calculated right, please reach out to support. But you also, if you really want to try it on your own, can try these different tokens and do it in your sandbox environment to see what it does. And is it calculating what you expect? If you really want to just try it on your own first, you're certainly welcome to do that, but we highly recommend you use your sandbox for that instead of a live system for that. All right, so get different examples of how that works. And the help here is great on just showing more detail on how deductions are configured. You'll see this is showing all of this information and talking about how these all work. All right, so if you need a little bit more detail on what do we mean by percentage of gross plus match, as an example, it tells you how this all works. All right, so additional reading to help with your sleep patterns, you can read these things and you'll get more information on this. Now, how do we assign the deductions to employees? So that's the last thing we saw, where the employees can see it in self-service, but sometimes we need to actually assign the deductions to the employees. Now, some of them may be set up as part of a benefit. So when I go to my benefits, I might say, oh, this dental plan, the deduction that would get added is called dental plan. So when I add this benefit to an employee, it will automatically assign the deduction. I don't need to do anything about that. Whether that assignment happens because I went to an employee and I go to their benefits screen and I add the benefit, this is one way to assign it. I can click add, select the benefit. Once I add it with whatever their options are, maybe they're doing like family coverage or something, it will calculate and add the deduction automatically. I don't need to do anything about that. When I add a benefit, just so you know, though, we do have things like deduction effective dates and expiration dates that are possibly different than the benefit dates. So if I selected this, it's going to have various settings in here for, like here, you'll notice here, I've got various configurations in my benefits, but whatever it calculates down here as far as the employee contribution, it's going to add that into add the deduction when I click save. So that's one way a deduction might get added. And again, that could happen in open enrollment. The person might go through, they sign up for medical, dental, vision, et cetera. And once that is approved, it adds those deductions to the employee. Now, that's one way, as I mentioned. Another way might be that you just go to the deduction screen and you add the deduction to the employee. Now, we don't recommend doing this for benefits. If you've got the benefits tied to a certain deduction, there's no reason to add the deduction here for that same benefit. But of course, there are deductions that are not related to benefits in any way, and you may need to add those manually. So you would select them. You'll see I do have ones that are related to benefits, or at least by name, but here's like that dental plan. In theory, I could add it. But if I did add the deduction, it's going to override what I'm doing. So what we would say is, only add the ones here that are not benefit related, because otherwise you might have just a bunch of confusion. So let's just say child support. Now this is a garnishment one. So I have some things down here I might need to set up, but here's my effective date. I could type it in or select it, and I might need to fill in some additional information. There might be a formula in here based off of my configuration, in which case I just leave it. But if I do need to say, oh, they're paying $300 monthly, and maybe there's a limit per pay period that they can do or something, I can put that in. Now with the garnishment, there are additional fields that you might need to fill in to track the information about this garnishment. You'll see like case number and payee name and the address and stuff like that, that you may want to track on a garnishment. Of course, these fields are not here for other deductions. If I selected a different one besides child support, let me just show you an example, whatever this one called deduction code is, it doesn't have those fields. All right, so just showing you the difference in how that might work there. Let me put that again at $300. All right, speaking on the limit here, what happens is, let's just say I put a limit in here of $5,000. It's going to keep coming out, whatever the frequency is, looks like monthly, until they reach $5,000 or until the expiration date is met. Now, child support is probably not a good example because it just keeps going until the agency tells you to stop. Typically, like the person turns 18 or something. But it just keeps going. Now, that other one called deduction code might stop after it reaches $1,000, or maybe you've got some other thing where there is a limit. It'll just stop and not take out the deduction anymore. Same thing would happen with the expiration date. If I said it expires at the end of July or something like that, the next pay date in August, it wouldn't come out, right? Because it's expired. What you cannot do is you cannot add two of the same deductions that are effective at the same time. So I cannot add two deductions with this child support deduction that would be active between June 2nd and July 31st. I can add another one that's effective August 1st, and there could have been older ones that were effective before June 2nd. So that's how that can work right there. And when I add it, I'm going to see this. Now, sometimes you might add something and you don't see it. That's, for an example, if you future dated something. If I went in here and I added a deduction and I said it's effective in July, well, it's not July yet. So if I come in here and I put in that they're paying $50 to whatever this deduction is, I might say, well, where did it go? It's inactive because it hadn't started. The same thing could happen if it had expired. It wouldn't show here, even though it was coming out of their paycheck. So just be aware of this checkbox right here, this little toggle, that if you add a deduction, maybe like your open enrollment, it's not effective until July 1st. You're not going to see those deductions until July 1st, or you toggle this one right here. Okay, so that is in a very high level, the deduction setup. Hope I answered a lot of the questions on there. I see there's one that came in. I'm not sure if our team that's on the panel has been able to answer that question there. Can you track the minimum coverage amounts for ACA forms? This amount could be different than the plan or the employee selects. That would be on the benefit, I would think, was where we would have that on there. And I know there are certain laws about the like the minimums on there. So we will, well, we can reach out to you about that one. There are certain things that the system controls based off of the regulations and what's applicable in the current year or the year where you're generating the forms. So thank you for the question. I think we might need to reach out to you and speak to you directly on that one to answer that question. So let's just quickly talk about our upcoming release, of course, but also our upcoming schedule. So here is our upcoming schedule. So we're going to take a little break because the next scheduled training is right before Independence Day in the US, right? It would have been on July 3rd, and a lot of people have that time off, or they're thinking about having time off and enjoying time with family and stuff like that. So we're skipping July 3rd, and we're going to go right to July 17th as our next training, when we're going to cover custom fields and screens. Now, also around that same time, in fact, it's the same, I believe it's the same week, if I'm not mistaken, is our next release. So we will have a release on there that we'll talk about our 25R1 release, or R2, yeah, R2 release, which is coming out. I believe the date is, the webinar is going to be on the 11th. So, of course, we will follow up on that if there's any differences in what I'm saying between now and then. We'll let you know. But that's about the time of the release, and we'll talk about leave of absence there at the end of July. Then we're actually going to. I'm giving you a little sneak peek here because 9-box grids are coming in the 25 R2 release, and so we're going to have a webinar on it in the middle of August. And then the last thing we're going to cover in August before we move into the fall timeframe is salary grades. So this is our upcoming schedule, possibly subject to change as we get later in the year if there's other things that we want to talk about. But here's what we have for the next 4, and we hope to see you at one or more of these here. And if you happen to be coming to the SHRM conference in San Diego, we hope that you will stop by our booth. We have a booth at SHRM, and we'll happy. A lot of us are actually going to be there, so you get to meet the faces behind the voices. And if you're there, please come by and say hi, and we'd be happy to meet with you. But otherwise, any questions you have about deductions or anything else, please reach out to us, help@criterionhcm.com, or you can reach out through your partner. So thank you very much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again in a few weeks.